At precisely 8:34 a.m. on July 5, 2005, aboard the MS Brilliance of the Seas, a steward noticed something irregular during his routine cleaning rounds. Below the railing of cabin 9062, on a white metal awning one deck down, streaks of dark red stained the surface, a smear more than a spatter, visible even under the morning sun glinting off the Aegean Sea. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't spilled wine. The guest registered to that cabin was absent, and the ship was far from shore. George Allen Smith IV, a 26-year-old newlywed from Greenwich, Connecticut, was reported missing within the hour. He had boarded the cruise ship less than 2 weeks prior with his wife, Jennifer Hagel Smith, embarking on a Mediterranean honeymoon. By all accounts, it was supposed to be a celebration. The Smiths were part of an affluent East Coast family. George, confident and sociable, had no known enemies, no history of mental instability, and no reason to vanish without a word. Security officers performed the initial welfare check. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. 2 pieces of luggage remained neatly stacked beside the dresser. George's passport, wallet, and other personal belongings were undisturbed. The bed was made on one side, pulled back on the other, but showed no overt signs of struggle. A half-empty glass of what smelled like whiskey sat on the nightstand next to an open laptop. The only unusual detail was the sliding balcony door, partially ajar. Beyond that door, a direct drop to the sea. Below, the smear of blood on the awning suggested someone had either fallen or been pushed. The angle and reach of the smear indicated movement, but nothing conclusive. No witnesses had reported screams. There was no alarm raised during the night. Royal Caribbean security protocols initiated immediately, though the limitations of maritime law soon became apparent. The ship, carrying over 2,100 passengers and hundreds of crew, was sailing international waters between Greece and Turkey. Greek authorities were notified as the ship was due to dock at Kusadasi that morning, but jurisdictional handoffs meant delays. The local Turkish police, untrained in complex forensic procedures, were the first to respond. Jennifer Hagel Smith, George's wife, was located 2 decks below their cabin, unconscious in a corridor near the ship's fitness center. She was barefoot, showing no clear injuries beyond a faint bruise on her forearm and a minor cut on her ankle. Ship medics attributed her condition to heavy intoxication. Upon regaining consciousness, she could not recall how she ended up there. More critically, she had no memory of the events following the couple's casino visit the night before. Interviews with passengers began immediately. Security logs indicated that George had last used his room key around 4 a.m. Prior to that, he had been seen drinking and gambling with a group of 4 men, Josh Askin, Greg Rosenberg, Zach Rosenberg, and Rusty Kaufman. The group in their early 20s had reportedly joined George for poker and drinks, described by other passengers as being rowdy but not violent. Multiple passengers in nearby cabins reported hearing a loud thud or crash sometime between 4:15 and 4:30 a.m., followed by silence. There was no follow-up, no screams, no banging on walls. It was the kind of sound that might be dismissed as cabin furniture shifting, common on a moving ship. Only when George failed to appear at breakfast and the blood was discovered did those noises become critical pieces of a timeline. The ship's surveillance system, though modern for its time, had critical blind spots. No cameras directly monitored the balcony areas. The hallways had partial coverage, but the stretch outside cabin 9062 was not included in the ship's standard rotation. The nearest functioning camera, placed at an intersection several doors down, showed a few indistinct shadows moving past frosted glass, but no clear identification of individuals or actions. This lack of video coverage would become a central point of contention in the investigation. By midday, Turkish police boarded in Kusadasi, and the crime scene became compromised. The cabin was sealed temporarily, but the bloodied awning was never swabbed with forensic precision. No luminol tests were performed inside the cabin. Several items, including bed linens and towels, had already been removed and laundered. Some of the blood had been partially scrubbed away by crew members following standard cleaning procedures before law enforcement arrived. Royal Caribbean issued a statement that afternoon suggesting that George Smith may have fallen accidentally from his balcony, possibly intoxicated. The public framing of the incident as a tragic mishap angered the Smith family back home. They had spoken to George the day before. He had been in good spirits, discussing future excursions. He was not suicidal. He was not careless. The company's narrative did not match the Sun they knew. Complicating matters further, Jennifer Hagel-Smith accepted the initial explanation without outward dispute. She made no immediate request to re-enter the cabin or assist investigators with a timeline. Her demeanor, as documented by Turkish authorities and ship security, was distant, detached. That observation, though factually recorded, would become fodder for speculation and media frenzy, painting her as either a grieving widow in shock or a person with something to hide. When the FBI joined the investigation days later in Naples, Italy, they arrived to a compromised scene, critical evidence gone, and a timeline that hinged on scattered recollections. The blood sample collected from the awning, the only substantial piece of physical evidence directly connecting to George's disappearance, would later be deemed insufficient for comprehensive DNA analysis. In the absence of a body, a confession, or an eyewitness, the case became defined by what was missing: footage, forensic clarity, and procedural thoroughness. Yet beneath the surface of that still Aegean water, one thing was undeniable. Someone knew what happened on that balcony. By the time Brilliance of the Seas docked in Kusadasi, Turkey, George Smith had been missing for nearly 6 hours. The Turkish authorities, technically the first to have jurisdiction, boarded shortly after 9:45 a.m. The ship's internal report had already circulated among senior staff. Male passenger age 26 unaccounted for, blood observed on the exterior canopy, wife located separately, heavily intoxicated, limited recollection. Local police were handed a crime scene already touched, altered, and partially cleaned. The Turkish police took photographs. They interviewed the on-duty steward and 2 nearby cabin attendants. They collected the glass found in the Smiths' room, a half-filled tumbler with visible fingerprints, but no immediate attempt to secure prints at the scene. The blood smear on the awning, substantial enough to be visible from the deck above, was noted, not preserved. No chain of custody documentation exists for the biological sample reportedly collected that morning. No forensic luminol test was conducted inside the cabin. The balcony railing, which should have been sealed for latent prints or smudge analysis, was wiped by ship staff hours before their arrival. Standard Turkish police documentation indicates a visual inspection of the cabin, minimal evidence collection, and the presumption of a fall. Their final entry notes: no apparent criminal activity. The scene was released back to ship security by mid-afternoon, and the cabin was reassigned within 48 hours. Ship logs show that while the investigation was technically ongoing, passengers were allowed unrestricted access to adjacent rooms and hallways. There was no perimeter established. No protective protocols were issued to preserve nearby evidence or record potential witness statements. A bottle of champagne from the night prior, part of the honeymoon package, was emptied and discarded before being documented. The casino chips George had cashed out with were never recovered. Statements from the crew reveal inconsistencies. One cabin steward, assigned to Deck 9, claimed to have seen George return to his room alone after 3:30 a.m. A second, working the early shift, recalled seeing a group of 4 young men walking hurriedly toward the forward stairwell just before sunrise. Both stewards were later reassigned and unavailable for follow-up interviews by U.S. officials. Of particular note was the absence of any formal passenger manifest check immediately after the incident. While George was listed as missing, the individuals he had been drinking with were never stopped or questioned by Turkish law enforcement. No names were recorded in the Kusadasi investigation file, beyond George and Jennifer Smith. Back in Connecticut, George's parents were notified by a cruise line liaison around 1:30 p.m. local time. The message was clinical. Their son had gone overboard. No body had been recovered. The ship was continuing its voyage. Royal Caribbean's corporate response leaned heavily on maritime legal precedent. The operating assumption was accidental fall, exacerbated by alcohol consumption. George's blood alcohol level would never be known. No toxicology could be performed without a body. No fall was witnessed. No video captured the moment. But the cruise line had, effectively, moved on. By July 6th, one day after the disappearance, Royal Caribbean's public affairs team issued its first press statement. It cited the incident as a likely tragic accident, while expressing condolences to the family. It referenced the ongoing cooperation with Turkish officials and assured passengers that all safety protocols were being reviewed. Behind the scenes, however, security staff had already begun scrubbing internal documents for language that could imply liability. An internal memo, leaked years later, revealed that security footage from Deck 9 was reviewed and not preserved beyond the mandatory 48-hour window. One snippet, showing shadowy figures near George's cabin around 4:20 a.m., was overwritten before the FBI could formally request it. No backup existed. On July 7th, 2 days post-incident, the FBI boarded in Naples, Italy. By then, the ship had passed through 2 additional ports, cycled through a new wave of onboard activities, and reassigned George and Jennifer's cabin. Investigators were immediately briefed on the Turkish report, which was thin, procedural, and inconclusive. They began building their own case from scratch, without a preserved crime scene, without a body, and without intact surveillance footage. Their first order of business was to establish a timeline. They worked from casino receipts, security swipe logs, and onboard purchases. George's room key was last used at 3:58 a.m. Jennifer's had not been scanned since midnight. From passenger statements, it appeared George was still with the same group of 4 men seen earlier in the casino, Josh Askin and the Rosenberg brothers, along with Rusty Kaufman. These men were described as loud, intoxicated, and animated, but nothing directly criminal had been reported. That alone did not constitute suspicion. But the timeline was narrowing. Forensic experts were brought in to re-examine cabin 9062. Though cleaned, trace elements remained. Under blacklight, smear patterns consistent with contact transfer were visible near the sliding door frame. A partial footprint, size 10.5, not George's size, was found near the balcony threshold. That shoe print was never conclusively matched to any known individual on board. The FBI asked for all internal logs, including maintenance records, cleaning staff rotations, and alcohol service logs. Of particular interest was a 911-style call made at 4:28 a.m. from a guest 2 doors down, reporting something loud described as like a heavy drop or a slammed door. Ship security responded, but no report of that visit was found in the official incident file. The responding officer's name was not listed. That absence of documentation, along with the lack of preserved video and mishandled physical evidence, solidified the Bureau's belief that they were facing more than a simple accident. But they had no body, no forensic certainty, and no legal authority to compel testimony in international waters. Every official action had to navigate the narrow lane between diplomatic courtesy and federal jurisdiction. In Connecticut, George's family released their own statement. They called for an independent investigation. They accused Royal Caribbean of mishandling evidence, downplaying facts, and prioritizing reputation over accountability. The cruise line denied those allegations. Jennifer Hagel-Smith remained on board for several more days, participating in few briefings and providing no public comment. The investigation, now under U.S. authority, continued, but its foundation was already fractured. The FBI's investigation into George Smith's disappearance began with a clear focus: the last people known to have interacted with him. Surveillance coverage was partial, physical evidence degraded, but the human element remained. Onboard witness statements consistently identified 4 men in George's company during the final hours of July 4th and into the early morning of July 5th. Josh Askin, 20, an American student from California, accompanied by 3 men of Russian-American background: Greg Rosenberg, Zach Rosenberg, and Rusty Kaufman, ages ranging from early to mid-20s. Known on the ship for their late-night presence in the casino and bars, they were described as sociable, loud, and prone to heavy drinking. No prior criminal records. But in the context of George's vanishing, their proximity required scrutiny. Security logs tracked George's room key activity until 3:58 a.m. Additional statements placed him at the casino earlier in the night, drinking alongside the group. George reportedly won a small sum at the poker table. Witnesses observed celebratory rounds of drinks. As the night progressed, multiple reports suggested rising intoxication levels among the group. Ship personnel last observed the 5 men walking from the casino toward George's cabin around 3:45 a.m. No official security footage captured their movement at the cabin's door, but cabin stewards working the forward hallway reported seeing them in the vicinity. This was the last independent sighting of George Smith alive. The FBI's interviews with the group revealed inconsistencies. Josh Askin stated that the group accompanied George back to his cabin briefly, but left him safe and sound, upright, and lucid. Greg Rosenberg corroborated this timeline, suggesting they spent no more than a few minutes with George before departing. However, cross-referencing with onboard transaction data revealed a discrepancy. Two of the men's shipboard accounts registered drink purchases at a nearby bar at 4:15 a.m., long after they claimed to have left George's cabin. Complicating matters further, a steward assigned to the deck reported seeing the group moving down the hallway together well after the alleged timeline. The steward described them pushing a folded wheelchair, which none of the men required. When asked, all four men denied using or moving any such wheelchair. No records of passenger wheelchair requests matched their profiles. In addition to conflicting statements, forensic re-examination of George's cabin turned up a partial footprint, size 10.5, different from George's shoe size. The FBI requested shoe size confirmations from the group. All four denied owning footwear matching that specification. However, later analysis of cabin photos revealed one pair of Nike sneakers, size 10.5, found in a cabin belonging to one of the Rosenberg brothers. This discovery was not sufficient for a direct forensic match, but the inconsistency was noted. Further investigative efforts involved analyzing shipboard swipe card data. George's keycard showed its last use at 3:58 a.m. The four men's keycards registered entries and exits from their cabins between 4:10 and 4:30 a.m. This aligned poorly with their account of returning to their cabins immediately after leaving George's. Moreover, the group's recorded cabin visits included short intervals, suggesting they were moving back and forth across decks rather than settling in for the night. Additional passenger testimony revealed more discrepancies. A couple from New Jersey, staying 2 doors down from George's cabin, reported hearing male voices and thudding noises shortly after 4:15 a.m. They initially assumed the sounds were typical of post-bar revelry, but the timing, paired with the absence of George, made it significant. Physical evidence on board remained scarce. The blood smear on the canopy outside George's balcony was too degraded for conclusive DNA analysis. The interior cabin surfaces, cleaned before the FBI's arrival, provided limited forensic opportunities. One wine glass, preserved by chance, bore fingerprints from multiple individuals, George, Jennifer, and at least one unidentified. The FBI secured the glass, but with compromised chain of custody, its evidentiary value was diminished. Despite these limitations, the emerging pattern was troubling. The four men's timeline did not hold under scrutiny. Their proximity to George during the critical window, their inconsistent statements, and the physical anomalies, unmatched shoe prints, unexplained movements, elevated them from mere acquaintances to persons of interest. Royal Caribbean provided limited assistance beyond the mandated level. Internal security logs, when reviewed by the FBI, showed missing entries for patrols conducted in the early morning hours. No explanation was provided for these gaps. Requests for complete surveillance archives were met with the acknowledgement that footage had been automatically overwritten, consistent with the ship's policy of retaining only 48 hours of data. The FBI's working theory, though still inconclusive, centered on the idea that an altercation or accidental event occurred in the Smith cabin, followed by a cover-up. Without a body or direct evidence of a crime, formal charges were impossible. But the timeline was fractured, the stories conflicted, and the silence from the group increasingly pointed toward something being concealed. By the end of the week, the FBI completed initial interviews and collected the available data, fully aware that the leads were cold and the trail deteriorating. The four men disembarked at the cruise's conclusion without restriction. No legal grounds existed to detain them, and they returned to their respective homes, leaving behind only questions. George Smith's family, following these revelations, amplified their calls for a comprehensive investigation. They urged the release of all onboard documentation, pressed for transparency, and continued to reject any narrative suggesting George had simply fallen. Their son, they argued, was robbed of more than his life. He was robbed of justice. By the time the Brilliance of the Seas reached its next port in Italy, the cruise line's corporate response was already in motion. Internally, Royal Caribbean classified George Smith's disappearance as a guest incident with suspected overboard fall. The language was deliberate. It implied no fault, suggested accident, and avoided any reference to foul play. For a company hosting thousands of passengers at sea, minimizing liability was procedural. The FBI agents arriving in Naples were briefed by ship security, but they encountered limited cooperation beyond what was required by law. While Royal Caribbean had protocols for missing persons, those protocols leaned heavily on the presumption of accident rather than crime. The initial report filed by the ship's security team, submitted within hours of the discovery of blood on the canopy, contained key gaps. No mention of passenger disturbances. No record of unusual activity in the corridors outside cabin 9062 during the critical time window. Investigators requested complete access to the ship's surveillance archives, swipe card logs, and crew rotation schedules. What they received were summaries, not raw data. When pressed for the original files, the company cited automatic data overwrites. Security footage, they claimed, was stored only for 48 hours unless flagged manually. By the time the FBI made its formal request, Deck 9 footage from the night of July 4th into the early morning of July 5th had been overwritten. No backup existed. This policy, while standard for the industry, was insufficient in the context of a potential crime. Forensic specialists on the FBI team reviewed the remaining security records. Only partial views of George and the group of men he had spent the night with were available. The critical hallway outside his cabin, where any confrontation or struggle might have occurred, lacked camera coverage altogether. The company's internal reports reflected a consistent narrative. George Smith had likely fallen from his balcony while intoxicated. Supporting this theory was a pattern of alcohol purchases tied to his account on the night of his disappearance. But investigators, aware of inconsistencies in witness accounts, rejected the simplicity of this conclusion. Alcohol consumption alone could not explain the blood smear's position and trajectory on the canopy, nor the absence of any direct witnesses to a fall. Corporate records revealed additional concerns. Cleaning logs showed that the area outside George's cabin had been sanitized by crew members the morning after his disappearance, before Turkish police or the FBI could conduct thorough forensic testing. Towels and bed linens were laundered, removing any potential DNA evidence. The explanation from the company was procedural housekeeping, but the timing, investigators noted, erased key forensic opportunities. One internal memorandum, later leaked, documented a meeting between Royal Caribbean's legal team and senior security officers. The focus: mitigate reputational damage. The suggested course of action included limiting public statements, avoiding direct interviews with George's family, and emphasizing the presumed accidental nature of the event. No mention of passenger altercations or onboard conflicts was included in any official communication. The Smith family, aware of these omissions, publicly criticized the company's approach. They filed formal complaints with U.S. maritime authorities and demanded independent reviews. Their statements highlighted the mishandling of evidence, the gaps in security coverage, and the company's failure to treat the case as a potential crime scene from the outset. Under increasing public scrutiny, Royal Caribbean convened a press conference. Their spokesperson offered condolences but maintained that all safety protocols had been followed. They cited the challenging jurisdictional complexities of international waters, asserting that law enforcement agencies, not the company, bore responsibility for determining the nature of George Smith's disappearance. The FBI, while operating within those same jurisdictional boundaries, continued to collect data. They subpoenaed Royal Caribbean for all internal correspondence related to the case. What emerged were fragmented timelines, inconsistencies in crew statements, and a corporate culture focused on risk management rather than investigative transparency. One notable document outlined the sequence of shipboard activities the night George disappeared. Scheduled events, casino hours, bar operations all functioned without interruption. No deviations in crew patrols were recorded, despite multiple passenger reports of late-night disturbances near cabin 9062. The official log contained no entry for a security check conducted after the thudding noises reported by nearby guests. As part of their analysis, the FBI reviewed the cruise line's safety policies. Balcony railings on the Brilliance of the Seas met international height standards. Falling over such a railing unintentionally would require a significant loss of balance or purposeful action. No previous reports existed of passengers accidentally falling from those heights under similar conditions. Meanwhile, the Smith family intensified their advocacy. They hired private investigators, lobbied congressional representatives, and demanded that cruise lines be held accountable for onboard security failures. Their efforts would later contribute to legislative changes, but at this stage their focus remained on recovering answers for George. The FBI, despite limited cooperation from Royal Caribbean, constructed a preliminary timeline. The last confirmed sighting of George alive was with the four men in the casino around 3:45 a.m. Their presence near George's cabin extended into the critical window between 4 o'clock and 4:30 a.m. Witnesses heard thuds. A steward saw the group moving through the hallway with a wheelchair, a detail the men denied. Physical evidence was minimal. The blood smear on the canopy remained unexplained. Ship cleaning records showed that items from George's cabin were removed and disposed of before forensic analysis could be performed. Security footage that might have filled in the gaps was gone. The investigation was compromised from the start, not by malice but by policy, by procedures designed for routine operations rather than serious incidents. The company's priority, clearly documented, was protecting its brand. Jennifer Hagel Smith was one of the few people aboard the Brilliance of the Seas who could offer direct insight into George Smith's final hours. Yet from the moment she was located unconscious in a corridor 2 decks below her cabin, her involvement in the investigation remained inconsistent. Her initial interviews with ship security and later with Turkish authorities produced fragmented recollections, primarily due to her intoxicated state that night. The FBI began their own evaluation of Jennifer's account as soon as they boarded in Naples. Medical reports from the ship's infirmary recorded her blood alcohol concentration as elevated, even hours after she was discovered. Her injuries were minor, a bruise on her arm and a superficial cut on her ankle. No defensive wounds, no signs of assault. Still, the location where she was found, separated from her husband, removed from their cabin, raised immediate questions. Jennifer's first formal statement to the FBI provided minimal clarification. She recalled returning to the cabin with George after spending time in the casino, but admitted to leaving again without him at some point. She could not specify the time, nor could she explain how she ended up in a different section of the ship. The agents documented her account, but considered its reliability limited due to her state of inebriation and the time elapsed since the event. Shipboard records, including swipe card data, showed that Jennifer's cabin key was last used before midnight on July 4th. There were no entries recorded for her key after that, suggesting that either George let her into the room or that they returned together without triggering a swipe. Surveillance footage from public areas offered no further context. Jennifer's movements were largely unrecorded in the hours leading up to George's disappearance. In the weeks following the incident, Jennifer returned to the United States, where she maintained limited contact with investigators and the Smith family. She cooperated with the FBI's early requests, but provided no significant new information. Meanwhile, her acceptance of Royal Caribbean's $1.1 million settlement in 2006 added another layer of complexity. The settlement, made without direct consultation with George's parents, was framed as compensation for her loss, not an admission of liability by the company. For George's family, Jennifer's decision to settle appeared premature. They believed that taking the settlement without pursuing further investigation undermined the search for answers. The relationship between Jennifer and the Smiths deteriorated rapidly, with both sides issuing statements through legal representatives. Jennifer insisted she wanted closure, while the Smiths viewed her actions as distancing herself from accountability. The FBI, focusing on the facts, kept Jennifer on their list of relevant parties, but never classified her as a suspect. They cited a lack of physical evidence tying her to any potential crime scene and no indication of direct involvement in George's disappearance. Her state that night, impaired as it was, placed her in the category of unreliable witness, not suspect. Further investigation into Jennifer's communications uncovered no incriminating exchanges. Her phone records and emails showed routine activity. An email she sent to a friend before boarding the cruise mentioned her excitement about the honeymoon and her plans to relax. Nothing suggested premeditation, conflict, or concern. However, one piece of evidence introduced another angle. A steward aboard the ship reported overhearing George and Jennifer arguing on the evening of July 4th. The topic, according to the steward's recollection, involved Jennifer's dancing with other passengers. While such an argument could be dismissed as a common marital dispute, it added context to the couple's dynamic that evening. The FBI examined this lead but found no further corroboration. No other passengers reported hearing or seeing a confrontation between the Smiths in public areas. Jennifer acknowledged having a few words with George that night, but minimized the severity. Without additional witnesses or physical evidence, the report remained a side note in the broader investigation. By mid-2006, Jennifer had remarried and begun to rebuild her life. Her decision to move forward, while understandable to some, was perceived by others as abrupt. Public opinion, fueled by media coverage, remained divided. Some viewed her as a young widow trying to heal. Others saw her as too willing to move on without seeking justice for George. From an investigative standpoint, Jennifer's role was static. She provided what information she could recall but offered no leads. The physical and digital evidence available, keycard data, surveillance gaps, forensic reports, pointed away from her as a direct actor in George's disappearance. But her emotional distance, her legal decisions, and her personal choices kept her in the orbit of suspicion for many outside the formal investigation. As the FBI compiled their interim findings, Jennifer's profile remained one of uncertainty. She was neither cleared nor implicated. The case, already hindered by lost evidence and procedural gaps, had no conclusive link to her. Yet, her involvement underscored the human complexity of the investigation, where fact, perception, and circumstance intersected without resolution. By the time the FBI stepped aboard the Brilliance of the Seas, they were well aware that the ship's surveillance infrastructure could make or break their case. In modern investigations, digital trails, camera feeds, access logs, system metadata are as critical as physical evidence. But in George Smith's case, what was missing from those systems became more significant than what was found. The cruise ship operated with a standard security setup common across the industry in the early 2000s, surveillance cameras installed in primary public areas, casinos, lounges, and some corridors, but with notable gaps. Deck 9, where George's cabin was located, had cameras only at the hallway intersections. The specific stretch of corridor outside cabin 9062, where any late-night movement would have mattered, fell into a coverage void. FBI forensic analysts reviewed the remaining footage, but the data available was limited and fragmented. One clip showed George and the four men, Josh Askin and the Rosenberg brothers with Rusty Kaufman, leaving the casino at approximately 3:40 a.m. Another segment caught their silhouettes moving through the hallway intersection near George's cabin at 3:45 a.m. After that, the record ended. The footage from the subsequent hours, including the critical period between 4 o'clock and 4:30 a.m., had been overwritten. Ship policy, confirmed by Royal Caribbean's legal team, retained security footage for only 48 hours unless flagged for preservation. The footage from the night George disappeared was not preserved in time. The ship's security staff did not mark it as significant until after Turkish police boarded in Kusadasi, well beyond the retention window. Automatic data cycling wiped the files, erasing a crucial opportunity to reconstruct George's last movements. Adding to this, logs of internal security patrols failed to match reported passenger accounts. While several guests on Deck 9 described hearing loud thuds and voices in the early morning hours, no corresponding incident reports or patrol acknowledgments were logged. A steward on duty claimed to have heard the noises and alerted security at approximately 4:28 a.m. Yet no call record or written report corroborated this claim. FBI agents cross-referenced the ship's internal communications but encountered incomplete documentation. Radio transmissions between security personnel were not recorded. Daily logs contained no entries suggesting that security had responded to disturbances outside George's cabin that night. This absence, combined with the missing surveillance footage, reinforced the investigative theory that critical evidence had been lost, or was never documented properly in the first place. Technicians examining the ship's access control systems found further discrepancies. Swipe card records for the crew and passengers, including Jennifer Hagel-Smith and the four men last seen with George, had irregular gaps. The group's key card showed entries and exits from various areas, but timestamp inconsistencies raised questions about the system's reliability. For instance, one of the Rosenberg brothers' cards registered 2 separate entries into his cabin within 5 minutes, logically impossible unless someone had duplicated or improperly logged the data. Investigators requested raw server logs from the ship's central systems. Royal Caribbean provided what they claimed was the complete archive, but metadata analysis revealed that segments from the night in question had been truncated or were incomplete. Whether this was a result of technical malfunction, human error, or deliberate tampering could not be proven, but the loss of digital evidence was undeniable. Additionally, maintenance records uncovered that certain cameras on Deck 9 had been flagged for repair weeks before the voyage. These included one of the hallway cameras nearest to George's cabin, marked as operational but intermittently offline. The issue was never resolved before the ship set sail. The repair logs, incomplete as they were, offered no assurance that the equipment functioned properly during the critical hours. Forensic IT experts within the FBI filed a formal observation. The ship's digital infrastructure, whether through negligence or design, could not sustain the level of scrutiny required for a criminal investigation. Security protocols prioritized passenger privacy and corporate liability over forensic transparency. Despite these limitations, investigators pressed forward, reconstructing what they could. Swipe data showed George's last known cabin entry at 3:58 a.m. The group of 4 men moved between decks for another half hour, with activity logs placing them in various corridors until approximately 4:30 a.m. The exact path they took and their actions during that time could not be reconstructed in full. One critical gap remained: the time between 4 o'clock and 4:30 a.m., untracked, unrecorded, and unverified. Passenger statements about hearing a thud, the unlogged steward report, the missing surveillance footage, all converged in this 30-minute window. The FBI's final digital report acknowledged these failures explicitly. The combination of overwritten surveillance data, incomplete access logs, and absent security documentation rendered the case technically unresolved. No digital evidence conclusively tracked George's movements or those of the 4 men during the period when he likely disappeared. As investigators finalized their forensic review, the limitations of the ship's systems became a central theme. In public discourse, the question shifted from what happened to why it couldn't be proven. Cruise ships, designed for leisure, operated outside the frameworks required for thorough criminal investigations. Their surveillance, while robust enough for minor incidents, failed under the weight of something more serious. On July 6, 2015, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally closed the case of George Smith IV. The statement, concise and final, cited insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. After a decade of forensic review, international coordination, and legal delays, the conclusion stood. The case was unresolved, but inactive. No body recovered, no suspect charged, no accountability established. The record reflected not a verdict, but a vacancy. The Bureau's internal report acknowledged multiple barriers: the compromised crime scene, the lack of preserved physical evidence, the erased surveillance data, the unreliable witness testimonies. The possibility of foul play was not dismissed, but no prosecutable case could be built. For investigators, the case's failures were procedural. For George Smith's family, they were personal. The Smith family responded swiftly and publicly. In their statement, they accused Royal Caribbean of obstructing the investigation from the start. They pointed to the ship's premature sanitation of the cabin, the overwritten surveillance footage, and the withheld crew logs. But they also directed blame at law enforcement. The Turkish police closed their portion of the case within hours. The FBI waited days to board, and when they did, the critical evidence was gone. Within their collected materials, the Smiths revealed a detail not previously made public. In 2006, a sworn statement from a former Royal Caribbean crew member had been submitted to authorities. The crewman testified that he overheard 2 security officers discussing surveillance footage showing a confrontation near George Smith's cabin. According to the affidavit, the footage was viewed briefly by ship officials, then not preserved. The FBI received this affidavit but classified it as unverified. It never became part of the formal case. When this disclosure reached the press, independent journalists reignited their investigations. They uncovered internal ship policy documents confirming that security footage could be manually flagged for retention beyond the 48-hour window. No officer had done so on July 5, 2005. The footage of that night, whatever it showed, was lost. Further inquiries found passengers who had not spoken during the original investigation. One couple recalled seeing a ship security officer near George's cabin at approximately 4 a.m. Another individual reported hearing a male voice pleading, followed by a heavy thud. None of these witnesses were formally interviewed by federal investigators before the case's closure. While the legal process ended with the FBI's decision, the public narrative did not. The Smith family redirected their energy toward reform. Their efforts helped lead to the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, signed into law after years of lobbying. The legislation mandated improved surveillance coverage, proper evidence retention protocols, and victim support services on cruise ships operating in U.S. waters. For the first time, cruise lines faced federal requirements aimed at addressing the security gaps exposed by George Smith's disappearance. Beyond legislation, the Smiths co-founded the International Cruise Victims Association, ICV, a support network advocating for families affected by crimes or disappearances at sea. Through the ICV, they connected with other families whose cases shared common failures, lack of jurisdiction, inadequate forensic procedures, and corporate reluctance to cooperate fully with investigations. George's case remained the most prominent. His story continued to surface in media reports, congressional hearings, and public safety discussions. Cruise lines under pressure, updated internal policies and security measures. Surveillance systems were expanded, retention periods lengthened. But for the Smith family, these changes came after the fact. They could not recover their son. They could only ensure others would not face the same silence. In interviews, George's mother often returned to the same point. George was excited for his honeymoon, happy to start a new chapter. His last voicemail to his family was upbeat, mentioning plans for upcoming excursions. There was no warning. Then, without explanation, he was gone. In the end, George Smith IV's disappearance did not conclude with justice. It concluded with reform. The investigation's shortcomings, technical, procedural, jurisdictional, became the foundation for change. The case file closed, but the ripple effects continued. Cruise ships sail in international waters where laws blur and responsibility diffuses. George Smith's case forced those waters into clearer focus. It exposed how easy it was for accountability to sink beneath procedural failure. But it also showed how survivors, families, advocates, lawmakers, could fight back against that current. Justice for George Smith never arrived in the form of charges or convictions. It arrived in the form of legal reforms, public awareness, and industry change. Yet even with those victories, the fundamental truth remained. A young man disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and no one was held accountable. The ocean keeps its secrets, but George Smith's disappearance ensured they would never be ignored again. After following this case for so long, I've come to realize that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in the courtroom. It arrives in the changes we make because of what went wrong. George Smith's story reminds us that even when the system fails to provide answers, we can still demand accountability and drive reform. I've shared this story not just to recount a tragedy, but to highlight how one family turned loss into lasting change. But what do you think? Should cruise lines be held to stricter standards? Or is the ocean just too vast for full accountability? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, or share what stood out to you most. And hey, if this story resonated with you, or if you believe stories like these need to be told, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next case we uncover together.